Hello and welcome to the TID Water and Power Podcast. I'm your host, Constance Anderson, and on this month's episode, we're discussing the current water year. From water available for irrigation, to flood control, to hydropower generation, TID is acutely aware of and extremely dependent on the hydrology of our watershed and local area. We've also lived through enough of the extremes, from drought to flooding, in just the last 10 years even, to know that a normal water year is rarely the norm. Thankfully, TID has a hardworking hydrology team constantly modeling the often erratic behavior of our weather system to help us sort it all out. On this episode, I'm joined by TID's Chief Hydrologist, Olivia Cramer, to discuss the current water year, potential outcomes over the next few months, and how those outcomes may affect the irrigation season and TID operations. Olivia, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So you have previously joined us on episode 5, which was about drought back in September 2021, episode 12, which was about hydrological forecasting and modeling in April of 2022, and episode 24, hydrology update and water year operations in April of 2023. So joining us today, you become our first official 4-time guest.
Well, thank you guys for having me so many times. I didn't expect to be asked back after all those occasions.
We love having you. And obviously, I think because this is one of those topics that we could talk about, you know, from week to week, from month to month, from year to year, and it's going to be so wildly different depending on, you know, the situation and what we're provided with, that it makes sense to, we'll keep bringing you back. So long as you keep saying yes, we'll keep bringing you back.
Perfect. No, that's what I love about the job. It is always exciting. We're always living extremes.
For sure. So let's start with, as we typically do, for our listeners who maybe haven't caught one of your previous episodes, and just tell us a little bit about your background with the district and what has changed since the last time you were visiting with us.
Sure. So I actually started as an intern with the district, and that's when I first kind of fell in love with the work that the district does, learned a lot about what they provide for the community, because you hear about TID a lot if you grow up in the area, but you really don't know the inner workings of what's happening. And so during that internship, I learned a lot from that process, and it really made me want to hopefully one day be hired on. And I was lucky enough that in 2018, I was hired on full-time as a utility analyst hydrologist for the district. And at that point, I had received my degree from UC Santa Barbara in hydrologic science and policy. And so it kind of fit right into the hydrology department and the work I was going to be doing. And then, you know, since the last podcasts I've done, I tried to continue my education as well. And so I have completed 2 master's degrees. So I got my master's in business administration and then my master's in industrial and systems engineering as well. And so those have kind of helped me broaden my perspective. And, you know, as far as hopefully it continues to help me in the future as I move into this new role as the chief hydrologist, which I was promoted into in just January of 2025 . So not too long ago.
Yeah. So you've been busy since we've had you on last.
It's been a roller coaster ride for sure. Yeah.
My goodness. Well, congratulations on the promotion to chief hydrologist. That's excellent.
Thank you.
I'd like to talk a little bit about your new role. What is the chief hydrologist at TID specifically responsible for?
Sure. So, I mean, other than, you know, you are managing the hydrology department, the major role of the chief hydrologist is that we are the project manager of Don Pedro. So although we work at TID, we are representatives for both Turlock Irrigation District and Modesto Irrigation District. And that's how we operate Don Pedro, is on behalf of both, and both the ratepayers of those 2 districts. And so our goals is to operate Don Pedro safely for the purpose of flood control. So we're responsible for downstream channel capacity within Modesto, as well as, you know, operating for water conservation and water supply purposes, ensuring we have enough water to meet our FERC requirements, which are our kind of environmental requirements downstream, as well as, what we're going to provide to the irrigation customers.
Okay.
Then, with that role, we need to make sure that we actually have the water to be able to serve those customers. And to do that within California, you needed to have water rights. So the other major role of our group is to make sure we're reporting and filing water rights and looking for new opportunities to file for water rights, depending on what our changing needs of our customers are in the future.
Sure.
And so with all of that, we're doing a lot of forecasting. What I didn't expect for this job is I've kind of had to become a meteorologist of sorts. And so there's a lot of tracking of storms, weather conditions, reporting out to different groups of what we're expecting. And then, of course, what is that forecasted inflow going to look like for Don Pedro, and looking out into the future, what those conditions are going to be. And with that, we also are providing on the power side. So as much as, hydrology is water and, that's kind of a little bit easier to capture. We also, because TID does provide power, and we have Don Pedro, which has hydroelectric units, we are giving the upstairs resource planning group what are those numbers of what amount of water can go through those generators, and then for them to see, is that enough to be able to support the grid, or do we need to go out and purchase more resources?
Sure.
Are we covered, and can we actually sell some resources out and make money off the market? And so those are decisions that can be made with those forecasts that we're providing for generation at Don Pedro.
Right. So truly, hydrology is one of those areas that touches all sides of the TID house.
Mm-hmm. That's what's so fun is I get to work with so many different groups, and I get to learn about a lot of different areas. I'm not stuck in, I guess a water bubble to say, and I get to work with your guys' group of communications and then upstairs on the power side. So it is a very unique position at the district.
Right on. Well, and I know you're only a couple weeks into your new role as chief hydrologist, but how's that transition been so far?
So far so good. The beginning of the year is always really crazy, no matter what, whether you're actually transitioning into a new role or not, because it's kind of, you're starting new projects, everyone's kind of reinvigorated, you're bringing new things online, new ideas, and so you're trying to get a lot done to, start the year off right.
Sure.
And so with that, and then I'm trying to transition into this new role. It can be busy for sure. And, you're responding to a lot of different things, and I'm trying to learn a new role while still also doing some of the things I was doing before. And so trying to find that balance between the two.
Sure. And then layer onto that the fact that this is one of the more volatile weather times of the year where you don't know, are we going to get rain? Are we not? Are there storms coming in? Are there not?
Exactly.
So it just compounds the transition, I would imagine.
Yeah. And I'm really thankful that, TID did a great job of, succession planning for this position. So that's why I do feel pretty well prepared moving into this. The previous chief hydrologist, Wes Monnier, who was on some of those podcast episodes with me.
Absolutely.
He always acted as a mentor to me, and he was always very, candid with me and mentioned of like, okay, at some point I'm going to be leaving the district, and I'm looking for someone who can fill those shoes. And so he did a great job of trying to teach me the role of chief hydrologist, because there is a lot of it that you can't just read in a book, right? Like a lot of the stuff that I'm doing, I didn't learn when I was in my, my college years, in my classrooms. They don't have like, how to operate Don Pedro Reservoir. A good portion of it, like we say, is an art more than a science to water operations, because it is a balancing act. You have a lot of requirements on you, and, no matter what decision you make, some people are going to be unhappy, some people are going to be happy, and you're trying to find that, perfect, the optimal spot in a way. So he really did prepare me well to start moving into this position.
Okay. And it is yet to be seen if your turn of phrase is as colorful as Wes's was. But
yeah, I've been working on my Texas accent and reading up on Southern
hospitality.
Hospitality, exactly.
Very good. Well, as you said, the succession planning was well thought out. And I know that I'm very confident we are in good hands with you as our chief hydrologist. So good luck to you in that role. So in this new role, are there any goals that you are bringing into the position, either short or long term?
Yeah, so I think in the immediate term, we're looking at doing a climate change vulnerability assessment for the district. So over the last 2 years, we had partnered with Cornell University as well as Department of Water Resources on what's called a weather generator.
Okay.
And the whole purpose of it, without getting too in the weeds, is, typically the way climate change is done is you look at these big global models and you downscale them. So you say, oh, this one expects 2 degrees of warming, and you take your historical data and you just bump everything up 2 degrees. Well, we know that from what we've been seeing with climate change, it's more about creating more volatility. It doesn't just mean things are getting warmer, right? Or things are getting drier. We're having wetter wet events, drier dry events, and you can have really cold events as well as really warm events. And so how do we capture that volatility? And that's the point of the weather generators, to capture the volatility we experience in weather. So we've been working with them as well as with Hydrocomp, which is who supports our internal HFAM model, the hydrologic model we spoke about in episode 12.
Okay.
And with that, we've created a bunch of scenarios, and under that, we're looking at where are the districts vulnerable? Where do we have gaps in our current system? How do we need to potentially adapt in order to continue serving our customers on the water and power side? So I think that's going to be a instrumental product in helping the district make decisions for the future.
Sure.
And that kind of comes right into the other project we're working on, which is the water augmentation study. So the district did file for floodwater rights within the Tuolumne watershed. And so with that, we proposed a lot of different projects, a lot of different new reservoirs, conveyance projects. And so as we go through the climate change study and we see where the gaps are, it'll help us make decisions of which of those projects should we prioritize. It's not just what dollars make the most sense. We also need to make sure we don't underbuild projects where we're not prepared for the future, because these projects are meant to serve us for the next 50, 100 plus years, similar to the way that Don Pedro has. So what do we actually need to make sure we're adapted to the future climate? And so we don't want to underbuild and we don't want to overbuild. We want to use the ratepayer funds appropriately, and that's the way that we can kind of make those policy decisions.
Okay, great. So what are some of those roles that you are taking on specifically that weren't previously under the chief hydrologist role?
Sure. So one thing that I've noticed for the hydrology department in general is we were actually part of the power side, housed under the power administration. And then after 2017, we were shifted into the water resources administration. And at that point, we kind of saw a change of a pure focus from as soon as it leaves Don Pedro, powerhouse in like LaGrange area, then that our job was done. So we were everything above LaGrange. That's what our focus was on. But once you move into the Water Resources Administration and we're down with irrigation and civil engineering, we start getting involved more actually in the lower system as well. So that's kind of an expansion of our role as being a resource, from the top of the watershed all the way to, the end of our canal system. And so that's an area where we're trying to see how do our current tools fit into that environment, and how can we apply some of the methods that we've used in the upper watershed and apply them to the lower system.
Sure.
And another area I see us expanding into is a little bit more on that policy side of things. Just like with that climate change study and water augmentation, the point of that is to help the board make decisions as far as what projects should we move forward on and how do we need to, set up the district to be successful in the future. And with that comes with, what are our regulatory requirements going to be moving forward? So that's where I've been doing a lot of work on the VA relicensing realm. So VA voluntary agreements, or now they're known as the Healthy Rivers and Landscapes project. And so that's where we're trying to see what kind of environmental requirements are we going to have for the river, doing habitat restoration, a lot of work to bring improvements to the Tuolumne system and for the fisheries on the Tuolumne. And so that's an area where I'm getting into that policy realm and making decisions on the technical components of that.
Okay, great. All right. So the last time we had you on the podcast, back in April of 2023, we were in the midst of one of the wettest years on record, a year that actually ended as the third wettest year on record. In general, how are things shaking out for the 2024-2025 water year?
Sure. So just to kind of give the listeners an idea, water year begins on October 1 and ends on September 30th, just so you kind of know what time frame we're looking at.
Not a calendar year.
Not a calendar year, not a precipitation year. The water year is something different. So it's something we always have to keep track of. And it's why we like to say Happy New Year whenever it hits October 1. That is a hydrologist New Year. But for us, as of February 9th, the watershed has received about half of the average precip it normally sees by this time of year. So we're at about 12.9 inches. And the typical average for this state is 25 inches. And then as far as snowpack, because that's really a bit major driver for us, right? We're a snow-dominated watershed. That's when we see the most benefit to us. So we always are watching that snowpack. As much as precipitation is important and drives that, we want to make sure a majority of that comes down nice and cold and comes down later when we really have the demand for it. And so snowpack is around 77% for the date. And, that's not too bad, right?
Yeah.
But we're still sitting around 50% of April 1. And April 1 is an important date because that's your typical peak snow water equivalent or peak date for snowpack.
Oh, okay.
And so that kind of really lets you know how close are you for the water year, right? Are we in good position if today it went dry? What are you looking at? Well, right now we're still sitting at 50% of that April 1 average. So we still have a ways to go to get to that average snowpack and really lock in the water year.
Okay. So that just, again, that April 1 date, that's kind of what we see as sort of the tipping point. Like whatever's up there in the snowpack as of April 1, that's then kind of what we know is going to run off, what we know we'll be working with to get us through really the irrigation season.
Yes, that's kind of the, a good way to put it is the transition from snow accumulation to snow melt runoff.
Okay.
And that's the time of year that you see that shift occur.
Okay, got it. So sitting at 50% of what we would like to see on that April 1 date, we'd really like to see a little bit more snow falling up there in the next couple months.
Absolutely, and I think a lot of the skiers and snowboarders in California are hoping for that too.
They would definitely agree with that. Absolutely. All right, so the Tuolumne River watershed that we're speaking of is up above Don Pedro Reservoir, and we know, like you said, what happens up there in that watershed is ultimately what impacts the TID system. So where are we currently sitting as far as what we have stored in Don Pedro right now?
So right now, Don Pedro is sitting at 777.89 feet of elevation. And just for reference, normally the maximum we can accumulate this time of year is at 801.9 feet. And that's regulated by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And the purpose of that is to ensure we have enough flood control space. If you do have, say, a warm storm that doesn't come in as snow, you want to be able to absorb it without immediately having to make large releases to the river, and you want to protect downstream communities. So that's the whole purpose of having only a certain maximum you can hit this time of year.
Okay.
And then, so as far as what that means as far as water supply, that's about 1.43 million acre feet stored in Don Pedro right now.
Okay. Which sounds like a lot, but we've still got space to fill if we needed to.
Yes, we still, normally, if you're looking at 801.9, that is about 1.69 million acre feet. So we're sitting at 1.43. We could be at 1.69 this time of year.
All right. Well, that doesn't sound terribly frightening. Doesn't sound overly optimistic either, but we know that every water year is different with regard to the amount of precipitation, the amount and quality of the snowpack, and then the temperature fluctuation from year to year and, a handful of other variables. Which of those things have the biggest impacts on where we sit currently with the water year?
So a big impact is looking at where we were in last year of 2024. We always like to tout you never have an average year. And 2024, we had almost smack dab average runoff values.
No kidding.
But it was average in volume, but it was not average as far as the way that volume came off. And that's an important thing to note. So in 2024, what we saw is runoff happened about a month earlier than you normally would expect it. So April 1, we had 100% of average snowpack. And so you'd expect, okay, you're going to have that running off nice and slow all the way through July, serving you through the irrigation season. But we saw this shift and we saw the snowpack was gone by beginning of June.
Oh, wow.
And at that point, we're just really ramping up into the irrigation season.
Sure.
And that means all of your irrigation supply or all your demand is now being served purely out of storage rather than being able to serve it from runoff, which means that we ended the 2024 water year lower than what you would typically expect if you did have average runoff.
And when you say lower, that's lower elevation in Don Pedro.
Lower elevation in Don Pedro. So typically after an average year, you would think we would be right at 801.9 feet, but we were sitting closer to that 775 mark by the end of the water year. And that was mostly driven by having runoff be shifted a whole month ahead where we couldn't capture, we didn't have the demand for that runoff yet. And so then you're just using storage in order to serve all your demands.
Okay. So now what about our precipitation levels? So we got some welcome rain in early February, but how much rain have we received in comparison to monthly averages?
Sure. So, we did have a decent November and December, right around average to slightly above average, but those are typically lower months as far as precipitation. You really get the majority of your precipitation in that January, February period. And unfortunately for January, we received less than an inch within the watershed. And, average for January is about 6.5 inches.
Oh, wow.
So we had a lot of catch up to do after January. And a lot of that was caused by a high pressure ridge that was sitting over the west coast of the United States. And so pretty much all of California, Oregon, Washington, what was dry for the month of January. And high pressure ridges are a fairly common phenomenon for the West Coast. It's what is a major driver of our droughts. So in that 2012 to 2015 period, you had what was called a ridiculously resilient ridge. And what they mean by that is it is a high pressure ridge just sitting there and it blocks any kind of moisture from coming into the area and it kind of pushes it all up north into Canada.
Oh, interesting.
So we don't really see the benefits of that moisture in the system.
Okay. And these high pressure ridges aren't necessarily something that come and go quickly. They can hang out for a long time?
They can hang out for a long time. A lot of times in the summer months, that they're there the whole summer. So it's months of high pressure ridges. It's a little rarer to see them hang out as much in winter, but we're seeing it more often now.
Again, that volatility you mentioned.
Exactly. So that's a major driver. But thankfully, we saw that ridge break going into February, and we finally saw, okay, there's, the moisture was always there, right? It's coming out of Hawaii and Southeast Asia. There's a lot of moisture there. You have a lot of heat moving through. And now we finally were seeing, we got some big forecasts in there. We were seeing some that went up to 22 inches in 16 days, which, if you're thinking about the average precipitation for the Tuolumne, that's about 36 inches is the normal yearly average. And we're looking at forecasts of 22 inches in 16 days. So you're getting a huge portion, almost 2/3 of your water supply in, a 16-day period.
That might have been a little bit more than we were looking for in any given 16-day period.
Exactly. I mean, we had some catch up to do, but and unfortunately, we didn't receive all of that 22 inches. Like we said, we've only received about 3 inches so far for the month of February, and then we, right now, if we're looking at the forecast, there's about 4 to 7 inches in the forecast moving forward. So it will put us potentially right at average or above average for February, but it definitely doesn't claw us all the way back to a perfect water year yet.
Sure. So then what does that mean for the rest of the water year and the outlook for the year as a whole?
So looking at the rest of the water year, if we have 90% exceedance conditions moving forward, we could end up very dry. So you're looking around 50% of average runoff for the water year. So less than half what you would normally see. And then if we experience 50% exceedance conditions or around average conditions moving forward, you're sitting around a 74% water year, which is a little better, but still not a full water year that you'd like to see. But then if we have 10% exceedance conditions for the year, you could end up above average and you're right around 127%. So we're still in this space where you could end up anywhere. A dry January doesn't mean a dry water year, right? There's so much variability in the system, and it can take just one storm. And that's kind of what we often see in our system, that you don't see a gradual, slow build in precipitation. It's one big event, and it might be a little bit dry after that, and another big event, and it's 2 or 3 events that drive the whole water year. And,
wow.
And that's why, we do so much work with atmospheric rivers, because that's what those events are. Those are the big water supply events for us.
Okay. Now, I want to circle back to something you mentioned when you're talking about the exceedances, because you talk about the 90%, which sounds like a lot, but then that's an example of what a drier condition would be. So can you kind of explain those for us, what you mean by the exceedances?
Sure. So 90% exceedance often will when we're talking in public sessions, we'll refer to that as our dry condition. And that just means that 90% of historic runs or scenarios sit above that value or are wetter than that condition, and 10% are drier than that condition.
Okay.
So, it's not exactly a probability, right? It's not telling you your likelihood of anything, but it's just saying if we're looking at the history over time, for the most part, a lot of years are still sitting above that point and would be wetter than that condition. And then similarly for the 50%, it's the same idea. 50% of years are wetter, 50% are drier, 10%, you're looking at 90% are drier, 10% are wetter. And so we simplified that down to dry, average, and wet. But I think it's important to note that it doesn't always mean dry, average, and wet. So if we're, depending on the time of year, the time frame you're looking at, runoff is driven by a lot of factors. Precipitation is a big component, right? But there's a reason why we're tracking temperature, wind, solar radiation, all these other meteorological things, because they impact runoff. And so in the summer period, sometimes when you're looking at 10% exceedance, it's not driven by a big precipitation event, and that's why you're getting all of this volume in that time frame. It could be you have really high temperatures that are actually creating that greater volume for that time period than what you see under the 90%, which has maybe cooler temperatures associated with it.
Okay.
And so you do need to pay attention to what time of year is it, what is the sensitivity of my system to different things, because depending on the time of year, it is mostly the variability is mostly driven by precipitation. But other times of year, the variability can be driven by those other factors like temperature and wind factors.
Okay, very good. So certainly as the year goes on and we have more of this data that we're seeing, kind of what's actually coming to fruition, we'll feed that into the various modeling system that our hydrology team works with. How often are we running these models, and how much does the output change between runs?
Sure. So it really does depend on the time of year and where Dom Pedro is sitting at the time. So if we are in drought conditions, it's the middle of summer, you really don't need to be running those models as often, right? Because
not a lot's going to change.
You're not seeing much in the forecast. You're not going to see a lot of changes in the system. So you run them less often. But as we get into the winter period, you're updating those models on a daily basis. So you want to make sure, okay, what is my current condition of my watershed? Make sure I have that locked in. And then you're trying to feed in these forecasts. So depending on what the forecast looks like, if my forecast is dry, I might do a run once a week on that observed watershed, and just to see, okay, we're not seeing any big changes, we're good to go. But if I'm seeing a lot of activity in the forecast and forecasts are changing each cycle, where forecasts are coming in every 6 hours, so I might have a forecast that has 20 inches, and so I want to make sure I get that run and I capture that and see what does that do to my watershed. And if the next one says, oh, actually it's only going to be 5, well, I want to rerun it and be like, okay, well, does that change my operations, and what is that volatility and spread and what we could see happening within the watershed? So, when we're in flood control and we're really close to that flood control line, we're going to be running it every 6 hours whenever we get those new forecasts to make sure, okay, we have all the bases covered. We've done our due diligence for the operations. And
then, as we kind of mentioned earlier, I would imagine that leads to just constant communication with all the other areas of TID as far as how what you're learning impacts operations throughout the district.
Exactly. And I think that's why I always provide everyone with the caveat of like, this is a forecast, and everything that I'm, that's driving this is up in the air. And, we do see a lot of volatility in the forecast too. Just the natural environment has a lot of volatility. Then you add in the volatility of those forecasts, and you can have a large spread in what could happen. So that's why the communication is so important, and to make sure that everyone knows why you're making the decision you are, and also what are the trade-offs depending if it goes in the other, either direction of higher or lower.
Right.
Of, are you having a water supply trade-off, or are you having a potential, flood risk trade-off, and where do you want to sit within, those boundaries?
Again, that balancing act.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Okay. All right. So a lot of modeling, a lot of different running the models over and over, depending on what's changing around us. What are some of those tools that you use to help you kind of come up with what these weather forecasts are?
Sure. So we want to make sure we're looking at all the different forecasts available to us. We don't just take one forecast and say, oh, this is it. This is, the end all be all. We want to see, like I said, we want to know what are those boundaries and what is the volatility in tracking them. So oftentimes you'll see in my reports to the board where we'll show the U.S. forecast, and that's called the GFS forecast, and that comes from the National Weather Service, or NOAA. And then you have what we call the European forecast when we're in board meetings, but that one's the ECMWF model. So you have U.S. and European model. And we like to compare those and track them. And whenever we see them kind of matching up with each other, that starts to give you a little more confidence in the forecast as far as, okay, these models have agreement with each other. This forecast is probably, pretty likely to occur. Versus other times where we see huge divides between the forecasts, where there's a lot more volatility, say, in the U.S. model. Earlier, I mentioned how we saw 22-inch forecasts going into February. Those were coming from the U.S. model, while the European was sitting right around 8 to 10 inches. So big spread between the two.
Yeah.
And so I was tracking of, okay, over time, the U.S. model kept slowly inching down. European stayed consistent. And so it lets you know, okay, maybe I am going to put a little more weight towards the European forecast versus the U.S. forecast. And in general, typically the European forecast does perform better than the U.S. forecast. Big reason for that is it has a higher resolution, so it's able to capture some of those more unique precipitation events and the kind of orographics, or as a storm moves up the mountains, how does that impact the physical characteristics of the storm and how it's going to react with the topography, essentially.
Oh, interesting.
So it can better capture that. But with it has to trade off, right? So the European doesn't update as often as the U.S. model, and that's part of the way it is able to have that higher resolution, because there is only so much computing power they can use, and these require a lot of computing power to, they're trying to model the whole entire atmosphere around the Earth. They're not just forecasting these one little area that we're looking at. They're doing it for everywhere, because it what's happening in Southeast Asia and Hawaii is going to affect what's going to happen to us. And so they're tracking all of those things. So European typically performs a little bit better. It's a little more consistent on its forecasts, but we have had times where the U.S. model kind of gave us the first heads up that things were going to turn really wet, and like, hey, pay attention to what's happening. And it ended up capturing some of those extreme events as well. So that's why just because one performs better more often, it doesn't mean the other one doesn't provide value to you.
Sure. Okay. Interesting. All right. So I'd like to kind of go back to what we had mentioned earlier about the work that you do with different departments around TID, and kind of focus on your coordination with the water resources group or water distribution specifically, the group that manages our irrigation for the year. With a wide range of potential outcomes yet to come in this water year, what sort of decisions are we making right now with regard to the irrigation season?
Sure. So I think I'll actually start back in January of where these conversations really start to happen.
Okay.
So with January, we were seeing dry conditions. And so there was this question of, if it stays dry, do we need to do early irrigation and open up the system, give, kind of one shot of water to the system just to hold people over, because we aren't getting any kind of local precipitation.
Okay.
So with that, I was running a lot of forecasts, letting them know, hey, this is what we're seeing. They're looking at, okay, are the temperatures going to stay low within the area? Then maybe there won't be as much demand for water, just because we haven't seen a lot of precipitation. If it's cold, you don't have as much demand. So those were things that we were tracking in the system and kind of having those conversations early on. And then once we saw things opening up in February, it became, okay, we are going to start seeing local precipitation. We won't need to open up the system early on. And then now we're having the conversations of, what is staff's recommendation going to be to the board as far as surface water allocation from Don Pedro? And so that is a process of, we have to look at the 90% all the way to the 10% and see how much carryover storage are we going to have available to us in the future, in case this is a start of a potential drought period, and that we're headed into a multi-year drought. We want to ensure we keep water in Don Pedro. That's the whole purpose of it, is to be able to serve our customers for multiple years, even if runoff isn't able to serve those demands. So those are the decisions we're making of, what is that recommendation going to be? And end of the day, it's always going to be the board's decision of what they want to provide, what the customers need and want, and that's their job to do, of letting us know what is necessary. And there's a lot of flexibility that we have, that we've gained over the years through investments in the system, in the lower system, that give us a better idea of, Don Pedro isn't our only resource, and where are areas we can tighten up and save water so we can provide more on farm. So those are, all those projects you see on the those regulating reservoirs that we talk about. Yeah. That's part of it, is to reduce some of those spills so we can put more on farm, as well as, implementing those Rubicon gates and being able to know exactly how much water is moving through each area. So we're tracking that, and we know where are our losses happening and what are we losing water to, where are we gaining water in the system. Local precip is part of our water portfolio, part of our water supply, as well as groundwater, and how can we use those all together to be able to serve our customers.
Okay. So what are some of the tools or measurements that are the most beneficial or impactful for your group in helping to make these determinations?
So a big component initially is going to be our HFAM model. So that's the internal hydrologic model we have. That's the one that's going to tell us how much runoff is going to come into Don Pedro. We can look at where Don Pedro elevation is going to be. We can do longer term outlooks for Don Pedro, so taking it all the way to the end of next water year, so that way you can play out multiple years of drought in that place and see where you sit. So that's one major tool, is you need to know, what is my supply? That's
Sure.
the first question. Then there's the question of, well, what is my demand in my system? And, what are my other sources of supply outside of Don Pedro? And that's where we've made investments in the LSAM model. And that is almost like taking the HFAM. There's a reason they sound very similar, the HFAM model thought process, and bringing it to the lower system.
And that's what that LSAM represents, is the lower system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Is a lower system analysis model. That's what the LSAM stands for. We love our acronyms. But yeah. And it is a mass balance model. It's looking at where are the inputs, where are the outputs in the system, to exactly see if I move this amount of water from Don Pedro, this is how much is going to end up on farm. So we can make decisions of where should we hold Turlock Lake in order to either increase recharge or to reduce seepage in the system if we need to conserve water. What kind of operations are we going to do on the spills? How many resources are we going to put to spill reduction in order to save water in the system? Or is it an extremely wet year where we're needing to move water through the system? And so you're going to operate differently, but depending on your current needs and demands. And then as well as, what kind of precipitation are we going to see in the system? Are we seeing a lot of, if we open up the system, say in March, but it's a really wet March, you're probably not going to have a lot of demand because you have that serving you. So you have more water for those future months to be able to serve. So those are all the things that we're trying to capture within the LSAM model to be able to make the best recommendation to the board.
Okay, very good. So I think the correlation between the irrigation team and the hydrology team is probably pretty obvious. But again, as we've said, your work touches so many different areas of the district. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those other departments and the work that you guys do in conjunction together with use of your data and kind of what you're seeing out of hydrology?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Like I mentioned earlier, that's probably one of my favorite things about this position that makes it exciting, is that we get to touch so many different parts of the district, get to learn about so many different areas of being a utility.
Sure.
And so one component was that resource planning department, where we're providing them with forecast for generation at Don Pedro, and so that's an area that we get to be involved in. Then we're working with dam safety, so we've actually used our HFAM model to help them do probable maximum flood operations to ensure that we're meeting requirements for Division of Safety of Dams, as well as FERC, to make sure that all of our facilities are up to code, essentially.
Right.
And so that was a really fun project to work with them. And anytime that we're in flood control, we're in close communication with dam safety to make sure, okay, in the case that we do need to utilize the spillway, what is the best operation? To make sure that we're protecting our other facilities and assets as well, and that we can do it as safely as possible.
Sure.
And then we also get to work with construction and maintenance a little bit. That's more on what I mentioned earlier about we also act as district meteorologists. So we will send out forecasts to construction and maintenance, and that helps them know, are we going to be delayed on our work for a week because there's going to be a lot of precipitation in the system, so we're not going to be able to work in this area.
Right.
So we've gotten to interact with them. Irrigation, of course, we've kind of already went through on allocation as well as forecasting. We'll let them know even during irrigation season of, hey, we're seeing really high wind forecasts. You probably are going to see a reduction in demand in the system because most farmers aren't going to want to put a lot of water on their land before a lot of wind comes through.
Absolutely.
So it helps them do some planning as far as their resources. And then thankfully I've gotten to work a lot with the external affairs group and with communications. So we're working on a lot of projects in the system. When we're in flood control, we need to make sure that the proper people are informed of what's going on, and also highlighting all of the great work that TID is doing. And then there is the policy regulatory aspect of what things do we need to make sure are funded? Just because TID is enjoying I think a great example is the Airborne Snow Observatory program. We were a pilot project for that, but we saw the benefit for all of California. And so we worked with external and government affairs to try and push for, getting budgeting in the state of California for that program.
Right.
So that's also like a great way to get involved in those parts of the district. We get to kind of go everywhere. I get to work with Power Control Center whenever we're sending out river orders and trying to figure out how are we going to operate LaGrange. Anytime they're doing tests at Don Pedro for the units or even at LaGrange, working through, okay, how are we going to move the water, and having big conversations with all the, kind of stakeholders involved within the district.
Yeah, right on. What an exciting opportunity for you and your team to kind of see as much as you do around the district, and what a resource you guys provide to all of these different areas. I mean, there's some incredible partnerships and synergies there for sure. So I want to go back a little bit to, again, some of the tools that you work with. And in some of your previous episodes, specifically episode 12, you went in depth about the HFAM model, which you've talked about today, ASO, which you just mentioned, which is the Airborne Snow Observatory. So I really encourage folks to go back and give that episode a listen. But there are some newer tools that you're working on developing. LSAM, which you mentioned earlier, the lower system
analysis model.
Model. There we go. Tell us a little bit more about that and about some of the other tools that you guys are ramping up and that you're really working with now, so more than you were the last time we spoke with you.
Sure. I mean, the way that we're able to be such a resource to the district is because we surround ourselves and we create partnerships to help us, right? We wouldn't be able to do it just with our little team responding to this. We need a lot of help and resources, and that's where we rely on partnerships to do so. So I think one of the big partnerships that we're really leaning into this year is with Scripps Institute. So we've talked about before where we use a lot of their products on atmospheric river forecasting to help us make operational decisions. And we've thought over the years of how can we expand this out more than just we looked at their products and we made some considerations. How do we really make it a part of kind of the culture, I guess, of the hydrology department? Okay. And what more could they provide to us that is less generic and very specific for the Tuolumne?
Okay.
And so we've signed a contract with them, and we're doing work over the next couple of years with them to provide us with improved weather forecasts that are at higher resolutions and better capture the dynamics of atmospheric rivers. Because that's the one thing with those bigger U.S. European models, they're not as adaptive. And they can't be super specific because they're trying to do hurricanes, atmospheric rivers, tornadoes, all of the different weather phenomena, versus Scripps can focus in on what ones really affect the west coast of California and specifically, Sierra Nevadas. And so they've created a forecast tool called West Wharf that's able to capture those things. Has made improvements to forecasting for our area. And so we want to be able to, how can we take that and feed it into our HFAM model and, move it along our workflows to be able to make decisions, as well as working with them on doing research of how can we maybe change the way we do flood control. We already kind of have implemented ourselves doing flood control a little bit different. If you looked at what we did in 2023, we knew 340,000 acre feet of flood control space was not going to be enough when you had 2 million acre feet of snowpack sitting up above your reservoir.
Sure.
And so we made early decisions to start making releases even when we had 600,000 acre feet of empty space. So we almost created 600,000 acre feet of flood control space within the system because that was what was prudent and necessary as being good stewards.
Sure.
And so our whole idea is the flood control curve is too restrictive and it hasn't responded to climate change. In some years when we're looking at, I think also last year is a great example where you see a whole month shift in when your runoff's coming off. Well, we want to be able to capture that, but the flood control curve doesn't allow you to start capturing until towards the end of April.
Okay.
Well, if all my runoff's starting to come off early April, I want to be able to capture that if I know I'm not going to get any more later on.
Yeah.
So I think that those are areas we want to work through, and we want to make sure also for the Army Corps that they need to make sure that there's liability to that, and they want to make sure all the due diligence is done, that it's a good decision, and that you have all the right tools to make those types of decisions, whether it is to make those early releases because you need more space than the 340,000 tells you to do, or that, actually you don't need 340,000 acre feet because it is really dry and there isn't much snowpack up there, and so there isn't a high flood risk. So maybe you need less than that 340,000. And how can we be a little more dynamic with those operations rather than following these rule curves that were developed in the 50s and 60s before we had all this technology and forecasting ability?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then I think there's the aspect of the weather generator, which I mentioned earlier. So we're going to continue working on that because with climate change, no one knows exactly what's going to happen.
Right.
So we still want to lean on this we've created a lot of different scenarios. We did 20 different scenarios for this because it depends on, are we going to have 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees of warming? Where are we going to sit? And that might lay in different time frames, right?
Sure.
It might be one represents more of a 50-year outlook and one's a 100-year outlook. But as we move through time, we're going to have more understanding of what's going to happen, so we can kind of hone in those scenarios and continue to do work on that. We're also utilizing it for our roadmap. So on the resource planning side, so this is another area where we're kind of playing in the power side sandbox, I suppose, is they're trying to look at how do we get to 2045 and how do we get to a fully carbon-free grid, essentially.
The push for renewables and clean energy.
And so our hydro portfolio is a huge component of that, and what Don Pedro is going to do is a big component of that. And so we want to capture under climate change, does that change? Do we have more gaps we need to fill, or is there more opportunities? And being aware of what those challenges and opportunities are going to be in the future as we try and move towards those clean energy goals.
Okay.
So that's another area that's going to be really exciting moving forward.
Yeah, definitely.
And then we do have Land IQ, and so that's where we've installed a bunch of weather stations within the local area. So this is where our team has shifted a little bit from the upper system to lower system. And this is really housed a lot within water distribution that they're doing this Land IQ. But the data coming from it is a lot of data that we utilize as far as getting meteorological conditions within the area. So every day I'm getting a report of precipitation temperatures at different locations in the district because it is different. You do hear about during a rainstorm where one person said, well, I got 2 inches at my place, and another person said, I didn't see any rainfall at my place. And how do we capture that variability just in our local area of like, okay, exactly where do we sit? And is one area getting greater water benefit from these precipitation events than others? Are we going to see a demand kick in earlier somewhere else because they didn't see the benefit of those storms versus this other area?
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be a unique place, and how can we integrate that information into LSAM, right? Because those are inputs to LSAM. And then, finally on irrigation is trying to do a demand model. And I kind of reference that of, is this area going to need water sooner than this area of the district? And how do we know when should we bring in water for early irrigation? Is there actually, just because it's been dry, is there actually demand? Does the cropping patterns require it? So how can we use that information to know when to bring in water, how much water to bring in, and to give more information to the board to make decisions?
Right. And again, just fine-tuning the way we're able to make decisions. It's less of a generality and more of a specific demand.
Yes, I think the district is, and everyone is shifting to really data-driven decision-making, right? We have so much data out there. How do we get our hands around it to actually make it useful, right? Data just sitting there is just a bunch of numbers. You have to put some work and put some, boundaries around it to then actually make it useful.
Absolutely.
To make decisions.
And thank goodness we have you and your team to absorb all that data and turn it into something useful for the district. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining us on the podcast again. As I said before, the information keeps changing, so we will keep having you back so long as you're willing to join us.
No, it's always a pleasure to get to talk to you guys and share what we're doing with the public.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, thank you, Olivia. Appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in to the TID Water and Power Podcast. You can find TID on Facebook at facebook.com/TurlockID, on Instagram and Twitter at TurlockID, and on LinkedIn as the Turlock Irrigation District. I'm your host, Constance Anderson. We'll see you again next time.